In the winter of 1882, the Duke of Ashworth paid more money than most men earn in a year for a single meeting. Not a business deal, not a political favor, not land, not influence, not any of the things that dukes typically spend fortunes on. He paid it to meet a woman whose face he had never seen, whose real name he didn't know, whose voice had kept him awake more nights than he would ever admit to anyone. He sat in a small room backstage at the Aldwych Theatre, hands clasped, waiting, with the particular tension of a man who has wanted something for so long that the moment of getting it has become almost unbearable. The door opened, and the Duke of Ashworth, one of the most powerful men in London, looked up and felt the floor disappear beneath him. Because he knew that face. He had seen it before. Once, 5 years ago, for approximately 3 seconds, and he had looked away. This is the story of what it costs a man to look away from the wrong woman, and what it costs him 5 years later to look back.
To understand that room backstage, we need to go back. Back to the autumn of 1877. Back to a ballroom in Mayfair, on a Thursday evening in October, when the Harrove family threw their annual autumn ball and invited, as they always did, approximately half of respectable London society. The Harrove Ball was one of those events that people attended not because they particularly wanted to, but because not attending sent a message, and in 1877 London, the messages sent by your social calendar were almost as important as anything you might actually say. The ballroom was magnificent. Chandelier light on everything, the kind of golden warmth that makes ordinary people look beautiful and beautiful people look like paintings. The orchestra was in full flight, the champagne was cold, the flowers were excessive in exactly the right way. And in the middle of all of it, 2 sisters stood side by side near the east wall, performing the particular art of being present without imposing. The elder was Eleanor Ashford, 22 years old, dark-haired, luminous in a way that the room had already noticed. She'd been asked to dance 3 times in the first hour, and the evening was young. She had the quality that certain women have in crowded rooms, a kind of gravity. People moved toward her without quite deciding to. The younger was Cecily. Cecily Ashford was 19 years old, and she was, here is the word the world had assigned her, gently but consistently, and with the particular cruelty of things said kindly, plain.
Not ugly. The world was careful to make that distinction. Not ugly, just not Eleanor. Quieter features. A face that didn't announce itself. Brown hair dressed carefully and somehow still just brown hair. She stood beside her sister in a pale green dress that her mother had chosen because it was sensible, and her mother was a woman who believed in sensible choices, and she watched the room with eyes that took in considerably more than anyone watching her would have guessed. She was not unhappy exactly. She had learned in 19 years to calibrate her expectations carefully. She didn't expect to be asked to dance first. She didn't expect the room to turn when she entered. She had made a quiet, private peace with the geography of her life, the way you make peace with weather, not because it's fair, but because it simply is. What she had not made peace with, what she would never quite make peace with, was the specific feeling of being looked through. Not at, through. As if she were glass, as if she were a gap in the furniture.
The Duke of Ashworth arrived 40 minutes into the evening, which was precisely calculated, early enough to be present, late enough to make the entrance mean something. His name was James Ashworth, 30 years old, the kind of man that rooms rearrange themselves around without anyone deciding to make it happen. Tall, well-dressed in the effortless way of someone who has never had to think about money, with the specific confidence of a person who has been told since birth that he matters and has had insufficient reason to doubt it. He was not unkind. That's important to say. He was not a villain. He was simply, as so many people are, entirely accustomed to a world that organized itself according to his preferences, and therefore almost completely blind to the people that world regularly overlooked. He came through the main entrance, shook 3 hands, said the right things to Lord Hargrove, declined the first drink and accepted the second, and began the comfortable work of existing at the center of a room that wanted him there. He noticed Eleanor Ashford within approximately 7 minutes. It would have been difficult not to. She was laughing at something her dance partner had said, a real laugh, not a ballroom laugh, and the sound carried, and James Ashworth was standing close enough to hear it, and he turned, and he saw her. He made his way across the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never been told no, and therefore sees no particular reason to rush. He passed Cecily on the way. Their eyes met. 1 second, perhaps less. Cecily, who had been watching the room with those quiet, cataloging eyes, looked directly at him. There was something in her gaze that he would not register until much later, in a very different room. Not hope, exactly, and not expectation. Just awareness. The look of someone who sees clearly and knows they are probably not going to be seen back. James Ashworth looked away. He continued to Eleanor. He bowed slightly. "Miss Ashford, I don't believe we've been introduced. I know who you are," Eleanor said, warmly, without artifice. "Everyone does." He smiled. "Terrible disadvantage, that. Dance with me, and I'll pretend I don't." He laughed, a real laugh, and offered his arm, and they moved to the floor, and the room shifted slightly to accommodate them, the way rooms do for people like that. Behind them, against the east wall, in a pale green dress, Cecily Ashford watched. She did not look away dramatically. She did not cry. She was 19 years old, and she had calibrated her expectations, and this was entirely within them. But something happened in those next few minutes, while her sister danced and the chandelier light did its golden work, and the orchestra played something beautiful and wasted on the occasion. Something shifted in Cecily Ashford, very quietly, very permanently. She reached a decision. Not dramatically, not with clenched fists or whispered vows, just a door closing softly inside her, and another one on the opposite wall, opening the smallest amount. She had been trying to exist in their world. She was going to find her own. The carriage home was 20 minutes. Eleanor talked for most of it. Not unkindly. Eleanor was never unkind. She was simply Eleanor, which meant she occupied space the way sunlight does, naturally and without apology. The Duke had been charming. Had he not been charming? Lord Hargrove's champagne was better than last year. Did Cecily think the Pemberton girl's dress was too much? It was too much, wasn't it? Their mother agreed about the dress and said Edmund Ashworth was a very fine prospect, and Eleanor had done very well this evening, very well indeed. Cecily looked out the window at the dark London streets and said, at the right intervals, "Yes," and "I think so," and "Quite." In her room, later, she sat at the small desk by the window, where she was supposed to write letters and correspondence and the other paper-based obligations of a young woman of good family, and she opened the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath the collection of items that could be described charitably as miscellaneous and accurately as hidden, was a program. A theater program, 6 months old, folded carefully, the creases worn soft from handling. The Meridian Theater presents an evening of music and drama. She had gone once, in the spring, with a school friend whose family had a different understanding of what young women could do with their afternoons. She had sat in the dark of that theater and felt something happen to her chest that she couldn't name and didn't try to.
Just sat with it, the way you sit with music that's too large for the room. She had been thinking about it ever since. She put the program on the desk, looked at it for a while. She thought about the ballroom, about 3 seconds of eye contact and a man continuing to walk, about the particular invisibility of being the sister who isn't Eleanor. Then she thought about the dark of the theater, about the woman on stage, the way she'd stood, the way the audience had leaned forward without knowing they were doing it, the way that woman had taken up space so completely, so unapologetically, that the room had no choice but to organize itself around her. Cecily put her finger on the program. I could do that, she thought. Not maybe, not I wonder if, just quietly, absolutely, with the certainty of someone who has been sitting on a truth for long enough to know its weight. I could do that. She closed the drawer, got into bed, lay in the dark. Tomorrow, she would begin. She began on a Tuesday. She told her mother she was visiting her friend Clara Whitfield for piano practice, which was partially true. Clara's house was involved, and a piano was present, though not for the reason stated. Through Clara, who had an older sister who moved in considerably more interesting circles, Cecily had found a name, a vocal teacher, Madame Voss, who worked out of rooms near Covent Garden and had a reputation for taking students that the more fashionable teachers wouldn't touch. Madame Voss was 62 years old, Hungarian by birth, London by choice, and completely without sentimentality about talent. She had seen too much of it wasted and too little of it recognized to waste time on feelings about either. She listened to Cecily sing for 4 minutes. Then, she said, in an accent that had never fully decided whether it was going to become English, "You have been hiding this." Cecily said, "Yes." "From whom?" "Everyone." Madame Voss looked at her for a long moment, the look of someone recalibrating. "Well," she said, "stop." That was the beginning. And in a ballroom across the city, the Duke of Ashworth was doing whatever dukes do on Tuesday afternoons, managing estates, attending meetings, moving through a world that made complete and comfortable sense to him, and he had already forgotten Cecily Ashford's face entirely. He would spend a great deal of money, 5 years later, trying to see it again. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. There is a particular kind of talent that survives being ignored, not the kind that needs an audience to exist, the kind that exists anyway, in the dark, in the quiet, in the bottom drawer of a desk beneath a folded theater program, the kind that has been feeding itself in secret for years before anyone else knows it's there. Cecily Ashford had that kind. And on a Tuesday morning in November 1877, she walked into a room near Covent Garden and began, for the first time in her life, to stop pretending she didn't. What followed was not a fairy tale. Fairy tales happen quickly, a glass slipper, a single night, a transformation complete by morning. What happened to Cecily was slower and harder and more real than that. It was early mornings and lied about afternoons, and a vocal teacher who had no interest in being encouraging when she could be accurate. It was the specific exhaustion of living 2 lives simultaneously, the Cecily who attended Sunday dinners and smiled at her mother's friends and was sensible and unremarkable and fine, and the other Cecily, the one who was becoming something in a room near Covent Garden 3 afternoons a week. It took 18 months before Madame Voss said she was ready. Ready for what? Cecily asked. Madame Voss said, ready to be heard. The question was, by whom, and under what name? The name problem was practical before it was anything else. Cecily Ashford could not perform as Cecily Ashford, not because her voice wasn't ready, it was, Madame Voss did not traffic in false encouragement, but because Cecily Ashford had a family,
and that family had a name, and that name meant something in certain circles, and those circles did not include women who stood on stages and sang for strangers, not in 1879, not in any world her mother recognized as real.
The consequences of being discovered were not abstract. They were specific, and they were severe. Her sister's prospects, her mother's position, the quiet architecture of the life her family had built, all of it load-bearing, all of it dependent on the Ashford daughters being exactly what they appeared to be. Cecily understood this. She was not naive about the cost of what she was doing. She simply had decided the cost of not doing it was higher. The mask was Madame Voss's idea, practically speaking. The name was Cecily's. "Something that says nothing about where you come from," Madame Voss said, sitting in her chair by the window with her hands folded and her expression professionally neutral. "Something that says only what you are." Cecily thought about it for 3 days. She thought about standing in a ballroom in pale green while the room organized itself around her sister. She thought about being looked through like glass. She thought about sitting in a dark theater and feeling her chest expand with something she couldn't name. She thought about what it meant to have a voice that nobody knew existed. "La voce oscura," she said, finally, back in Madame Voss's room on a Wednesday afternoon. The dark voice. Madame Voss considered this. "Dramatic," she said. "Yes," said Cecily. "Good," said Madame Voss. "Dramatic is useful. Forgettable is not." She reached into her desk and produced a mask. Plain, black, the kind used in theatrical productions, covering the upper half of the face. She held it out. Cecily took it, turned it over in her hands. "Put it on." Madame Voss looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in the old woman's expression. Not sentimentality, she didn't do sentimentality, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who has been waiting a long time to see a particular thing and has finally seen it. "Now," said Madame Voss, "sing." The first performance was a small theater in Southwark, 80 seats. Half of them filled, the kind of venue that gave unknown acts a chance because it had nothing to lose and occasionally everything to gain. Cecily stood in the wings and shook. Not visibly. She had spent 19 years being invisible in rooms full of people, which meant she had developed, without knowing it, considerable control over what her body communicated to the outside world. Inside, she was shaking. Her hands, her chest, the small bones of her knees. Outside, she was still. Madame Voss was beside her. She didn't say anything encouraging, because she didn't do that. She said, "Your breath is too high. Drop it." "Good. Now go." Cecily walked out. The lights were brighter than she'd expected. She couldn't see the audience clearly. Shapes, the suggestion of faces, a rustling that settled as she reached center stage. She was wearing a deep blue costume, something borrowed from Madame Voss's extraordinary collection of theatrical odds and ends, and the mask, and a composure she had assembled from scratch in the previous 48 hours and was not entirely confident would hold. She opened her mouth, and the shaking stopped. This is the thing about voices like Cecily's. They have their own authority, separate from the person they belong to. The moment she sang, the Cecily who was terrified stepped back, and something else stepped forward. Something that had been waiting, patient and certain, in the bottom drawer for 2 years. The audience, which had been sitting with the polite tolerance of people who have paid a small amount and are hoping for something adequate, went very still. By the end of the first piece, nobody was rustling. By the end of the second, 3 people in the 4th row had leaned forward without noticing they'd done it. By the end of the evening, the theater manager was waiting in the wings with an expression that looked very much like a man doing arithmetic in his head and liking the numbers. Cecily walked off stage, past him, past Madame Voss, all the way to the small dressing room at the end of the corridor, and closed the door and stood against it in the dark. And then, alone, with nobody watching, she allowed herself to feel it. All of it. The shaking, the relief, the enormous, terrifying joy of it. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and felt her shoulders heave once, twice. Not crying, or not only crying, something larger than crying. The way your body sometimes responds to truths that are too big to process quietly. She had done it. She was real. Outside the door, Madame Voss waited and said nothing, and allowed her student the full 60 seconds before knocking briskly and saying, "The manager wants to talk. Fix your face first." Word travels quickly in theatrical London, even about unknown quantities. Perhaps especially about unknown quantities. The mystery of La Voce Oscura, the masked soprano from nowhere, who sang like that and then disappeared into the London night, was more interesting than a known name would have been. By the fourth performance, the 80 seats were full. By the sixth, people were being turned away. By the eighth, Lord Edmund Ashby was in the front row. He was 64 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of face that reads as distinguished until you look at the eyes, which are doing something slightly different from the rest of the expression. He had made a considerable fortune through a combination of inheritance, strategic marriage — his wife had died 11 years ago, quietly and conveniently — and what he described as patronage of the arts, which was accurate in the technical sense that money had changed hands in artistic directions. What it meant in practice was that Lord Ashby had a very good instinct for valuable things, and an equally good instinct for acquiring them at a favorable price. And he had spent the better part of 30 years applying both to human talent, which was, if you got there early enough before the talent had anyone sensible advising them, surprisingly affordable. He sat through the entire performance without moving. Afterward, he came backstage. Cecily was at her dressing table, still masked, removing her costume with the efficient movements of someone who had performed enough times to have developed a routine. The theater manager knocked and opened the door, and said with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it, that Lord Ashby was outside and would very much like to introduce himself. Cecily looked at the door in the mirror. She knew the name. Most people in London knew the name. Edwin Ashby appeared in the society pages regularly, attended the right events, was described in various publications as a great friend to the arts. 5 minutes, she said. He came in and sat without being invited to, which was the first thing she noted. The second thing she noted was the quality of his attention, focused, assessing, the look of a man who was already calculating rather than simply experiencing. He complimented her performance at length and with apparent sincerity, which she absorbed without expression. Then he said, "I think you're being significantly underserved by your current arrangements." Cecily said, "Go on." He went on. For 20 minutes. He talked about larger venues, about the right audiences, about the kind of campaign that could make La Voce Oscura not merely a southward curiosity, but a London phenomenon, a European one if she was interested in that. He talked about his connections, his experience, his track record. He mentioned several names that were impressive and were meant to be. He was charming, he was persuasive, he was very good at this. Cecily listened to everything and said, "I would need to see any arrangement in writing." Ashby smiled. "Of course, I'll have my solicitor draw something up." His solicitor drew something up. It was 14 pages long, which was reasonable, and contained within it, in the kind of language that is designed to be technically accurate and practically invisible, several clauses that were not reasonable at all. Clauses about revenue division that favored Ashby significantly. Clauses about creative control that favored Ashby entirely. A clause about exclusivity that meant Cecily could not perform, record, or negotiate with anyone else without his written permission. Cecily had not, at this point, had a solicitor of her own. She had had Madame Voss, who read the document, said several things in Hungarian that Cecily didn't understand, but grasped the spirit of, and told her not to sign it. Cecily did not sign it that day. She went home. She sat at her desk,
the same desk with the drawer where the program had lived, and she read the document herself 3 times with a dictionary for the legal terms.
She understood what it meant. She understood what she would be giving up. She also understood what she would be getting. The larger stages, the real audiences, the possibility of becoming something instead of remaining, forever, a Southwark curiosity with a growing waiting list and no idea what to do next. She thought about it for 4 days. On the 5th day, she signed. It was the most consequential mistake of her life, and she made it with open eyes, which is the particular tragedy of intelligent people who don't yet know what they don't know. What followed was, in the ways that could be seen from outside, extraordinary. Ashby was as good as his word on the things that could be measured. The venues got larger, the audiences got better. The name La Voce Oscura moved from theatrical circles into society ones. By 1880, there were people who had seen The Masked Soprano 3 times and were planning a 4th. By 1881, there were people coming from Paris. The mystery of it helped, which Ashby understood very well. The mask, the unknown name, the absolute refusal to be interviewed or photographed or identified in a world that was beginning to be saturated with public personalities. A deliberate absence was its own kind of presence. People talked about La Voce Oscura the way they talked about things they couldn't quite grasp, with a kind of hunger. Cecily understood this too. She wasn't naive about the machinery of it, but understanding the machinery and controlling it were different things, and control was what the 14 pages had mostly removed from her.
The money was the most obvious problem. The percentages that had looked merely unfavorable in a solicitor's office looked actively unjust when applied to the sums that were now moving through La Voce Oscura's engagements. Cecily lived comfortably. Ashby wasn't foolish enough to make her circumstances visibly poor, but the distance between what she earned and what she received was a number she had eventually stopped calculating, because calculating it made it difficult to perform. The control was worse. Every engagement required Ashby's approval, every venue, every program, every decision about where and when and how. He framed this as management, as expertise, as protection, and in some technical sense it was those things. But it was also a cage, built from the clauses of a 14-page document that she had signed with open eyes 5 years ago. She had tried twice to renegotiate. The first time Ashby had been charming about it. The second time he had been less charming and clearer, and she had come away from that meeting understanding something she had perhaps always suspected. He needed her voice more than he liked her, but he intended to keep both, and he had the legal architecture to do it. She was La Voce Oscura. She was the talk of London. She was extraordinary and recognized and entirely unable to leave. And every night she stood in the wings before a performance and dropped her breath and walked out into the light, and the shaking stopped, and something else stepped forward. And for 2 hours, none of it mattered. For 2 hours, she was simply the voice. That was what she had. That was what she held on to. And in the audience, night after night, in various seats, in various venues across London, increasingly in the front row, increasingly with the expression of a man who has lost track of the boundary between appreciation and obsession, sat James Ashworth, the Duke of Ashworth, who did not know he was watching the woman he had walked past in a ballroom 5 years ago and had not looked at since. He knew nothing except that he had never heard anything like it, and that he would pay whatever it cost to get closer, which, as it turned out, was exactly the wrong thing to want. There is something almost poetic about obsession that doesn't know its own origin. James Ashworth, the Duke of Ashworth, was not a man given to obsession. He was, by his own understanding and by the general consensus of everyone who knew him, a reasonable man, measured, capable of perspective.
The kind of man who made sensible decisions and slept well afterward and didn't spend unreasonable amounts of time thinking about things he couldn't control. This is what he believed about himself in October of 1881, when his friend Gerald Cavendish dragged him to the Aldwych Theatre on a Tuesday evening because Gerald had heard something extraordinary and couldn't find anyone willing to cancel their plans on short notice. James went because Gerald was persistent, and the alternative was an evening reviewing estate correspondence, which had its own particular tedium. He sat down in the third row. The lights went down. And the James Ashworth who made sensible decisions and slept well and had a measured relationship with his own emotions sat in the dark and listened to La Voce Oscura sing for the first time. And that James Ashworth did not entirely come back. Something replaced him, something that looked identical from the outside and was, in almost every practical respect, the same man, attended the same meetings, managed the same estate, said the correct things at the correct dinners, but was now quietly, persistently, unreasonably reorganized around a voice he had heard once and could not stop hearing. He didn't say anything to Gerald on the way out. Gerald, who had been watching James's face during the second half with the satisfaction of a man whose recommendation has been spectacularly vindicated, said, "Well?" James said, "Yes." Gerald waited for more. More didn't come. "That's it?" Gerald said. "Yes." "What would you like me to say?" "Something. Anything. You look like you've been hit by something." He considered this. "I'm fine," he said, and meant it in the way that people mean it when they're busy trying to understand what has just happened to them and don't want the complication of someone else's attention while they do it. He went home, poured himself a drink he didn't particularly want, sat in the chair by the fire. He tried to identify, with the reasonable part of his mind, what exactly had occurred. He had heard a very good singer, an exceptional singer. He was not unmusical. He could recognize the difference between exceptional and merely accomplished, and this had been exceptional. The voice had a quality that was difficult to describe precisely, which he found mildly frustrating because he preferred to be precise. It was not simply power, though there was power in it. It was something more like truth. The kind of sound that bypasses the part of the brain that evaluates and goes somewhere older, somewhere that doesn't have the option of not responding. He had also, he noted with some clinical detachment, been entirely unable to look away from the stage for approximately 2 hours, which was unusual. He was not typically a person who lost track of where his attention was going. He finished his drink. He went to bed. He did not sleep particularly well. The following Thursday, without mentioning it to Gerald or anyone else, he went back. He went back 7 times in 2 months. Each time he told himself it was the last time, not because he was embarrassed by it. He was slightly, but not enough to stop, but because there was something mildly alarming about the degree to which a single evening's entertainment had reorganized his interior life, and the reasonable part of him felt that he should probably reassert some authority over the situation. The situation was unimpressed by this reasoning. By the 5th visit, he had moved to the front row, partly for the acoustics, and partly, he admitted this to himself with the grudging honesty of a man who's been caught out by his own psychology, because from the front row he could see her more clearly. The mask covered the upper half of her face, the costumes were elaborate and period-specific, and told him nothing about the person inside them, but there was something in the way she moved, the way she held herself on stage, a quality of self-possession that he found inexplicably more compelling than the voice itself. She didn't perform for the audience. That was the thing. Other performers, even very good ones, had a quality of projection, of reaching toward the room, of needing the response. She didn't need it. She sang as if the audience's reaction was entirely beside the point, as if she would be doing this whether they were there or not. James Ashworth had been in rooms his entire life where everyone was performing for him, consciously or not. The experience of watching someone who wasn't was disorienting, and riveting. He began trying to meet her after the sixth performance. He sent a note to the theater management, politely worded, name prominently featured. He was not above using the name when it was useful, and it was almost always useful. The response came back within a day. La Voce Oscura did not do post-performance meetings. He was welcome to attend future performances. He attended future performances. He tried again. A more direct note this time. A more specific request. A more substantial sum of money mentioned in a way that was not quite an offer, but was clearly gesturing toward one. The response? The same, more briefly worded. Gerald, who had by this point noticed that James was attending the same theater with suspicious regularity, said over dinner one evening, "You've lost your mind over the masked woman." "I find her work interesting," James said. "You've seen her 8 times. 9. Gerald put down his fork. "James, she's extraordinary. She's a mystery, which is not the same thing, and I think you know that." Gerald picked his fork back up. "What do you actually know about her?" James considered this honestly. "Nothing," he said. "Right," said Gerald. "So what you've lost your mind over is a voice and a mask and your own imagination." James was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I'm aware of that. And I'd still like to meet her." Gerald sighed, in the way of a man who has known someone long enough to recognize an immovable position. "You're going to make a fool of yourself," he said. "Possibly," said James. "Pass the wine." The lights from the stage made it difficult to see the audience clearly. This was something Cecily had learned to work with rather than against. The darkness of the house, the suggestion of faces, the sense of a crowd as a single breathing entity rather than a collection of individuals. It was easier, in some ways. You could feel the room without having to see it. But the front row was different. The front row was close enough that the stage light caught faces, and on her 7th performance since James Ashworth had begun his attendance, something made her look. She looked at him during the second piece, a moment between phrases where her eyes moved across the front row in the way they sometimes did, registering without focusing, and something snagged. She finished the phrase, started the next one, looked again. The face was familiar in the way that faces are familiar when you've seen them in a different context, in a different life, in a room you haven't thought about in 5 years. It takes a moment for the mind to relocate the memory, to pull it from wherever it's been stored and hold it up against the present and say, "Yes, that one." She finished the piece. The audience applauded. She moved into the third piece, which she had performed enough times that her voice knew it without her, and she could think while she sang, which she occasionally did, and which she did now. James Ashworth, the Duke of Ashworth.
Harrove Ballroom, October 1877. Pale green dress. 3 seconds of eye contact. A man continuing to walk. She turned the information over while her voice did what it did, examined it from different angles, the way you examine something you found and aren't yet sure what to make of. He had been here before. She thought about the front row seat, the regularity of the presence she'd registered without identifying. He had been here multiple times. She reached the final phrase of the third piece, held the last note. She had learned exactly how long to hold it, had learned the specific quality of silence that follows when you've held it correctly, the held breath of a room that doesn't want to break something. The silence came. She lowered her head. The applause started. She walked to the wing. And there, in the dark, with nobody watching, no audience, no Ashby, no theater manager with arithmetic in his eyes, Cecily Ashford allowed herself a single, private, completely unperformed smile. James Ashworth, the dupe of Ashworth, was sitting in her front row. Had been sitting there apparently for some time. Had paid, presumably, for the privilege.
The man who had walked past her in a ballroom without breaking his stride was now spending his Tuesday evenings and his Thursdays, she thought, recalling the regularity, watching her, without knowing it was her. She stood in the wing and felt the smile, and felt something else underneath it. Something that had been compressed for 5 years, that had sat quietly beneath the discipline and the work and the management of Ashby's contracts and the management of her family's ignorance and the management of every single thing that had to be managed in her particular complicated life. Something that felt, if she was honest, very much like winning. Not revenge. She was careful about the word revenge. It was too hot, too obvious. But something adjacent to it. Something that was the feeling of a story going differently than it was supposed to go. Of the room reorganizing itself, not around Eleanor, not around James Ashworth, not around anyone with a better dress or a bigger name. Around her. Around her voice. Around something that had been in the bottom drawer, patient and certain, for 2 years before she let it out. She fixed her expression, straightened her spine. The next piece was in 4 minutes, and she needed to be ready. But she allowed herself, for those 4 minutes, to simply feel it. James Ashworth's attempts to meet La Voce Oscura had, by November of 1881, become something of a known quantity in certain theatrical circles. Not a joke, exactly. He was a duke, and dukes are not joked about to their faces, but a known quantity. The theater managers discussed it. The stagehands knew. Even some of the other performers had heard. The Duke of Ashworth, front row, every performance, sending notes that came back unanswered. Ashby knew, of course. Ashby knew everything that happened in the orbit of his investment. He had known from the second note, had been informed by the theater management within hours, and had sat with the information for a while, turning it over in his particular way, examining it for value. A duke. Obsessed, willing to spend. There was something there. He wasn't sure yet what, but there was something. He did not tell Cecily immediately. He filed it away for the right moment, which was something Ashby was very good at, identifying the right moment for things. James, unaware of any of this, sent a third note. This one was different from the first two, less formal, less name prominent, less obviously strategic. He had sat down to write it, and then sat for a while before writing, which was unusual for him. He was not typically a man who found correspondence difficult. He wrote, "I am aware that this is the third such note, and that the previous two received the same reply, and that a reasonable man would conclude from this pattern that the reply is unlikely to change. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I am not being entirely reasonable about this. I would very much like to meet you. I don't have a better argument than that. A." He used only the initial. He wasn't sure why. It felt less like a duke writing to an employee and more like a person writing to another person, which was what he intended. The note went to the theater. The theater, per established procedure, passed it to Ashby's office. Ashby read it. He read it twice. Then he smiled, the particular smile of a man who has identified the right moment, and began to think about numbers. Ashby told her about the Duke on a Wednesday morning, in the office above his Mayfair townhouse where they had their monthly meetings, the meetings where Cecily received her percentage and Ashby received everything else, and they both pretended this was a normal arrangement. He mentioned it casually, as if it were a minor administrative matter. "Ashworth has been trying to arrange a meeting. I've kept him at bay, but he's persistent." A pause, timed well. "He's willing to pay significantly for a private audience, maskless." Cecily looked at him. "No," she said. "It's a substantial sum. I don't care. Cecily, the mask doesn't come off. That's not a negotiation point, Edwin. It's never been a negotiation point. You know that." Ashby was quiet for a moment. Then he slid a piece of paper across the desk. She looked at it.
The number written on it was significant, more than significant, the kind of number that meant things, meant freedom, potentially, or the beginning of it, meant solicitors and renegotiation and options that currently didn't exist. She kept her face entirely neutral, which cost her something. "Who is he?" she said. "Ashworth, James Ashworth, Duke of—" "I know who he is," Cecily said. Something must have shifted in her voice, some infinitesimal change of register, because Ashby looked at her with slightly more attention than usual. "You know him?" "I know of him," she said, which was technically true and contained everything.
She looked at the number again. She thought about Madame Voss, who had told her not to sign the first document and had been right. She thought about the 14 pages and the clauses and the monthly meetings where she received her percentage and Ashby received everything else. She thought about what that number could mean if she were careful with it. Thought about solicitors, about options. She looked up. "I have conditions," she said. Ashby smiled. "Of course. I choose the venue, I choose the time. 5 minutes, not a second more. And the money comes to me directly, not through the usual arrangement." Ashby's smile didn't move. "The last condition is non-negotiable," Cecily said, "as is all of it. Yes or no?" A pause. "Yes," said Ashby. Cecily nodded, stood up, gathered her things. At the door she paused. "Edwin," she said, without turning around. "The Duke. What name did he give in the notes?" "Just an initial, A." "Ashworth. James. He goes by James." She left. In the carriage back across the city, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out at London moving past the window and thought about a ballroom in October 1877 and a man walking past her without breaking his stride. She thought about 5 years of silence and a bottom drawer and a mask and 14 pages of small print and monthly meetings and a percentage that wasn't. She thought about what she was going to do with 5 minutes. 5 minutes was enough.
She had learned, in the years since that ballroom, that a great deal could happen in a very short time if you knew what you were doing. She knew what she was doing. She watched London go past and felt, settling into her chest like a note held perfectly, the particular calm of a woman who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment and can see it now, close enough to touch. It was almost time. There are moments that a story has been building toward from the very first sentence. Every scene before it is preparation. Every character detail, every small humiliation, every quiet decision made in a bedroom late at night, all of it is weight, accumulating, and the moment itself is what that weight has been pressing toward all along. For this story, that moment is a small room backstage at the Old Witch Theatre on a Thursday evening in December 1881. We've been moving toward it since a ballroom in October 1877, since a pale green dress and 3 seconds of eye contact and a man who kept walking, since a bottom drawer and a folded program and a woman who decided, quietly and permanently, to find her own world. We're almost there. But first, the hours before, because the hours before a moment like this matter. They're where you find out who people actually are, when the performance hasn't started yet and the armor isn't quite on.
Cecily woke at 6, which was her habit, and lay in the dark for a while before getting up, which was not. She was not a woman who lay in bed. She was a woman who woke and moved. Tea, practice, the day's work, forward. Stillness made her impatient. She had too much to do and had always had too much to do, and had learned early that the gap between where she was and where she intended to be closed faster when she was moving than when she was thinking about moving. But this morning she lay in the dark and let herself think. tonight. James Ainsworth was coming tonight. She had been careful in the weeks since she'd agreed to the meeting not to give it more weight than it deserved. It was 5 minutes. It was a man who had once looked past her and who would now look at her, and she would be composed and cold and entirely in control, and then it would be over, and she would have the money, and she would begin the conversation with the solicitor she had already identified, and life would continue. That was the plan. Simple, clean, forward-moving. She lay in the dark and examined the plan for weaknesses. The weakness was this. She had imagined the meeting many times in the past few weeks, running it like a rehearsal in her mind, and in every version of it she was perfectly controlled. She said what she intended to say, she looked how she intended to look, she gave nothing away.
But she had also, in some of those rehearsals, thought about the moment when he recognized her. If he recognized her, she corrected herself. There was no certainty he would. 5 years was a long time, and she had been forgettable. And in those moments, the control she was planning had a quality of thinness to it, a tautness, the kind that holds until it doesn't. She was not going to let that happen. She got up, made tea, stood at the window and watched the gray December morning settle over the rooftops. She thought about her father, which she did sometimes when she needed steadying. He had been a quiet man, a solicitor, not musical himself, but patient about her music in the way of someone who doesn't understand a thing but can see that it matters. He had died when she was 16. She still thought about him more than she mentioned. She thought about Madame Voss, who had told her once, at the end of a particularly difficult lesson, when Cecily had been frustrated with herself in the way she sometimes was, the perfectionist impatience that drove her and occasionally exhausted her, that the voice could not lie. Other things could lie, the body, the face, the carefully chosen words, but not the voice. The voice, when you were truly singing, was the only completely honest thing a person could offer. "Then I'll never speak to him," Cecily had said. Madame Voss had said, "Good, speak less, sing more," now again from the beginning. Cecily finished her tea. She had a performance tonight. That was the main event. The meeting was 5 minutes, backstage after the curtain. That was all it was. She put on her coat and went to practice. James Ashworth's morning was less philosophical. He had a meeting at 9 about a drainage issue on the northern portion of the estate, which was exactly as interesting as it sounds, followed by correspondence that required his signature and attention in roughly equal measure, followed by lunch with his cousin Edward, who talked for most of it about Edward's children and Edward's horses and Edward's recent acquisition of a property in Hampshire that Edward clearly expected James to admire. James admired it, said the right things, ate his lunch. Edward, who had known James for 30 years and had the unsentimental perception of someone who has watched a person closely for a long time, looked at him toward the end of the meal and said, "You're distracted." "I'm not," said James. "You've agreed to everything I've said for the past hour without pushing back on any of it. You always push back on something." James considered this. "The Hampshire property does sound very fine," he said. "I've been exaggerating for effect to see if you'd notice." Edward set down his wine. "What's happening tonight?" James looked at him. "Gerald told me about the theater, about the significant amount of money you've apparently arranged to spend on a 5-minute meeting. Gerald talks exactly the right amount. What's happening tonight, James?" James was quiet for a moment. Outside the restaurant window, London went about its December business, gray and purposeful. "I'm meeting her," he said. "The masked woman." "Yes." "And you expect this to—" Edward paused, visibly searching for a word that was honest without being unkind. "Resolve something?" James thought about that. "I expect it to answer a question," he said. "Which question?" He didn't answer that.
Not because he didn't know, but because the answer was one of those things that was true and also, if you said it out loud to your cousin over lunch, sounded slightly ridiculous. The question was, who are you? That was all. After 14 months and 11 performances and a small fortune in theater tickets and the 3 notes and the negotiation through Ashby's office, all he actually wanted to know was who she was. The face behind the mask, the person behind the voice. Something real, something specific, something that would replace the version of her he'd been constructing in his imagination with an actual human being. He was self-aware enough to know that his imagination had probably built something impossible, that the reality would be different, smaller, more ordinary, more explicable. He was, in some ways, counting on that. He wanted to stop thinking about her. "It'll be fine," he said to Edward. Edward looked at him with the expression of a man who doesn't believe that but has learned when to stop pressing. "Good luck," Edward said, and meant it entirely. The performance that evening was one of the best Cecily had ever given. She knew it while it was happening. There were performances where you were slightly outside yourself, managing the technical elements with one part of your mind while another part monitored and adjusted and worried. And then there were performances where all of that collapsed into a single thing, where the technical and the emotional became the same motion, and you weren't managing anymore. You were simply there, fully, every part of you in the same place at the same time. This was one of those. She didn't know why entirely. Perhaps the sharpness of the evening ahead, the specific focus it had given her, perhaps simply the particular alchemy of a good night, the right temperature in the room, the right quality of audience attention, the right feeling in her chest when she drew breath for the first phrase. Whatever it was, the room felt it. She could feel them leaning forward, could feel the specific held breath quality that a room gets when it's not thinking about itself anymore, when the self-consciousness of being an audience has dissolved into something more direct. She held them for 2 hours without trying, without calculating, just sang and let the voice do what the voice did when she let it. She did not look at the front row. She had decided, in her morning rehearsals of the evening, not to look at the front row. Seeing him beforehand, seeing him before the 5 minutes, in her space, in the dark while she was performing, was a variable she didn't need. She looked at the back wall, as she sometimes did, fixed a point, sang. The final piece was the one she'd finished for her father. She had added it to her permanent repertoire 2 years ago, quietly, without announcement. Most audiences didn't know what it was. It was unlisted, unnamed, the piece that came after the program ended, the one that made people stay in their seats because somehow they knew it wasn't finished yet. She sang it and felt him in the front row even without looking, and thought, after this, the 5 minutes. She held the last note, let it go. The silence came, clean and complete. Then the applause, and she was walking to the wing, and Ashby was there with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, and she didn't look at any of them, just kept moving, down the corridor, to the dressing room. 5 minutes. She fixed her face, squared her shoulders, opened the door. The room was small, a rehearsal room off the main backstage corridor. 2 chairs, a small table, a lamp. Neutral territory, or the closest thing to it that a theater could offer. Cecily arrived first, which was intentional. She stood near the window. There was no window, there was a wall, but she stood in the position she'd have taken near a window and settled her breathing and was ready when the door opened. James Ashworth came in. He was, she registered this with the detached accuracy of someone taking an inventory,
largely as she remembered him. 4 years older, the edges of him slightly more settled, the way people become more themselves as they age rather than less. Still the quality of a man accustomed to rooms organizing themselves around him. Still the particular bearing of someone who has never had to think about whether he had the right to be somewhere. He saw her, and stopped. Cecily watched it happen, watched the moment of impact, the first look, the instinctive assessment, the thing that happened to his expression when he saw that the mask was gone. He had paid for this, she reminded herself. He had paid a significant sum for exactly this moment, to see her face. She had known, agreeing to it, that there would be this quality of being looked at, and she had decided she could manage it. What she had not entirely accounted for was the second thing that happened. The first thing was the impact, seeing her, processing her, the instinctive and immediate response of a man who had spent 14 months constructing an imaginary person and was now being given a real one. The second thing was recognition. She watched it move across his face. Slower than the first thing. It required more processing. It was reaching into a further part of memory, pulling something from 5 years ago and holding it against the present. She watched him do it, watched his expression change as the pieces connected. The ballroom, the east wall, the pale green dress. She said nothing. She had decided she would say nothing first. This was his moment to say something. She had given him that much. She would let him arrive at it himself and say it himself, and she would stand here and be entirely still and let him understand. He understood. She could see the exact moment, a change so specific she could almost date it, almost say, there, 9:47 p.m., that is when James Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth, realized who was standing in front of him. The color didn't drain from his face. He wasn't a man who drained, but something went out of it. The prepared for this quality, the practiced gracious meeting quality, the Duke attending a significant social occasion quality, all of it vacated suddenly, and what was left was something much less composed. Something that looked, if she was honest, a great deal like a man who has just understood something about himself that he would prefer not to have understood. Good, she thought. He opened his mouth. He started. Stopped. Tried again. You were at the Harrove Ball in 1877. Yes, said Cecily. He paused. You're Miss Ashford, Cecily Ashford. I was, she said. I go by something else now. A silence. He was looking at her with an intensity that had nothing performed in it. No duke at a social occasion, no gracious patron of the arts. Just a man who was looking at something he needed to understand and was not yet understanding it. I walked past you, he said. Not a question, a statement, made to himself as much as to her. The specific, flat quality of a man identifying his own behavior and not finding it flattering. You did, said Cecily. You didn't. No, she said. You didn't. Another silence. Cecily was very still. She could feel the 5 years in the room, the weight of them, the specific gravity of everything that had happened since that October evening, all of it present and accounted for. She had imagined in her rehearsals that this would feel like more, that there would be something hotter in it, sharper, more satisfying, the clean, precise pleasure of a reversal completed. She had expected something that felt like winning. What she felt instead was complicated. He looked, standing there in that small room with his practiced composure entirely gone, less like the man she'd been angry at for 5 years, and more like someone who was genuinely reckoning with something. Not performing remorse, actually reckoning. She had not, in her rehearsals, fully prepared for that. I owe you an apology, he said. You owe me nothing, Cecily said. We didn't know each other. I walked past you. Men walk past women at balls every evening. It's not remarkable. I've been... He stopped. For 14 months, I've been coming to your performances. I've been... Another stop. He seemed to be having some difficulty with sentences, which she suspected was unusual for him. I didn't know it was you. I want to be clear about that. This wasn't... I know, Cecily said. You didn't recognize me. No. You never looked long enough to recognize me. It came out more directly than she'd intended. Not cruel, just true. The kind of thing that is true and lands cleanly because of it. He didn't deflect it, didn't smooth it over with a diplomatic reframe. He absorbed it, in the way of someone who knows they deserve it. No, he said. I didn't. The lamp on the table threw a warm light across the room. From somewhere down the corridor came the muffled sounds of the theater clearing. Voices, footsteps, the post-performance dispersal. The world outside this room continuing, as it always did, indifferent to what was happening in it. Cecily looked at him. And something happened that she had not rehearsed, had not prepared for, had not included in any version of this evening that she had run through her mind in the weeks since she'd agreed to it. She believed him. Not about the apology. The apology was easy. Apologies cost very little. But about the looking, about the 14 months, about the expression on his face right now, which was not the expression of a man calculating his next move or managing a situation. It was the expression of a man who had just seen himself clearly and was not comfortable with what he'd seen. She had come into this room with 5 years of compressed feeling and a plan that was clean and controlled, and ended with her walking out and him staying, the reversal complete, the story closed. She had not planned for him to be this. Why did you want to meet me? She said. Really? He looked at her for a moment. Then, because I needed to know who you were, the real person. I knew I'd built something in my imagination, and I wanted to replace it with something true. A pause. I didn't expect the true thing to be this complicated. What did you expect? Someone easier to leave behind, he said. The room was very quiet. Cecily felt something shift, very slightly, very carefully, the way ice moves before it breaks. Not breaking, just moving. Your 5 minutes are nearly up, she said. I know. He didn't move toward the door. Miss Ashford. La voce oscura, she said. Not unkindly, just, this is who I am now. Use the right name. La voce oscura, he said, and then quieter, may I come to the next performance? Cecily looked at him. You've been coming to the performances, without asking. I know. I'm asking now. A long moment. The lamp. The distant theater sounds. 5 years of everything in the space between them. The tickets are available at the box office, she said, and turned, and walked to the door, and opened it, and left. In the corridor, she walked steadily, all the way to the end, all the way around the corner, out of sight. And then she stopped, and stood against the wall, and pressed one hand flat against the cold plaster. Her heart was doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. She stood there for a moment, breathed, dropped the breath, the way Madame Voss had taught her, low and steady. She had gone into that room to close something. She was not entirely sure coming out of it that she had. There is a particular kind of danger that wears a respectable face. Not the obvious kind, not the raised voice or the visible threat or the villain who announces himself. The dangerous kind is the kind that sits across from you in a well-furnished office and speaks in measured tones and has very good manners and has spent 30 years making sure that every door out of the room he's built around you is locked from the inside. Edwin Ashby had very good manners.
Cecily had known, for some time, the shape of the cage she was in. She had known it in the way that intelligent people know uncomfortable truths, thoroughly, accurately, and with the particular exhaustion of someone who understands their situation completely and has not yet found a way out of it.
What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, standing in that backstage corridor with her hand pressed against cold plaster and her heart doing unauthorized things, was that the way out was already in motion. James Ashworth had gone home from that small room a changed man. Not in the dramatic, instantaneous way of stories, in the slower, more genuine way of someone who has seen something true about themselves and cannot now unsee it. He had walked past her. He had looked through her like glass in a ballroom in 1877 and continued to Eleanor with the unthinking ease of a man for whom the world had always sorted itself by his preferences. And then he had spent 14 months in her front row, paying to hear a voice he couldn't stop hearing, and the voice had been hers all along. He sat in his study that night for a very long time, and then he began to make some inquiries.
The inquiries started with Gerald, who knew everyone and had strong opinions about most of them, and was, beneath the social ease, considerably more perceptive than he appeared. James found him the following morning at his club and said without preamble, "What do you know about Edwin Ashby?" Gerald looked at him over his coffee. "Ashby, the patron." "Yes." "Why?" "Humor me." Gerald humored him. What he knew about Edwin Ashby was, on the surface, entirely respectable. Old family, good connections, known supporter of the arts, sat on several charitable boards, attended the right events. All of it accurate. All of it, Gerald said, with the slight pause of a man reaching for something less comfortable, entirely surface. "Meaning," James said. "Meaning that the people he supports," Gerald said carefully, "tend to remain supported. They don't move on. They don't expand beyond what he's arranged for them. They stay exactly where he puts them, and he collects the benefit of their work, I suppose, and they don't seem to be in a position to change that." "How is that legal?" "Contracts," Gerald said simply. "Very long ones, written by very good solicitors." James was quiet. "Why are you asking about Ashby?" Gerald said. "She's contracted to him. La voce oscura." Gerald absorbed this. "Ah," he said. Then, "ah," again, differently. "What does ah mean?" "It means," Gerald said, "that this has become considerably more complicated than a man attending too many theater performances." He set down his coffee. "What are you going to do?" James looked at him with the expression of a man who has already decided something and is only now catching up to his own decision. "I'm going to find out exactly what the contract says," he said, "and then I'm going to talk to someone who knows what to do about it." His solicitor's name was Mr. Horace Webb, 60 years old, dry as paper, with a mind like a very clean and well-organized filing cabinet. James had used him for estate matters for a decade and trusted him completely, partly for his competence and partly because he had the rare quality of telling clients things they didn't want to hear without visible discomfort. James explained the situation. Not all of it, not the ballroom, not the 5 years, not the thing that had happened in the small backstage room, but the relevant parts. A performer, a contract with Ashby, concerns about the terms. Webb listened without expression. "I'll need to see the document," he said. "I don't have it." "No," Webb said, "you wouldn't." A pause. "There are ways to obtain a general understanding of Ashby's standard arrangements without having the specific document. I have encountered his solicitor's work before." Another pause, which contained within it a comprehensive opinion of Ashby's solicitor's work that Webb was too professional to state directly. "Give me a week." Webb took 4 days. He appeared at James's study on a Thursday morning with 3 pages of notes in his neat, compressed handwriting and the expression of a man who has confirmed something he suspected and is not pleased about it. "The standard arrangement," Webb said, sitting down and organizing his pages with the precision of someone who finds disorder personally offensive, "gives Ashby controlling interest in all engagements, all revenues above a fixed weekly sum, all recording and publishing rights, and exclusive representation for a period of, in the most recent contracts I'm aware of, 10 years. James stared at him. "10 years?" he said. "With renewal options that are structurally difficult to decline." "That's—" "Yes," Webb said. "It is." "Can it be broken?" Webb considered this. "Broken is a strong word. Contracts of this kind are designed to resist breaking. However," he referred to his notes, "they are not designed to resist purchase. The contract is an asset. Assets can be sold. If Ashby were presented with a sufficiently compelling offer for the contractual interest, he'd sell. He is," he said carefully, "a man who responds to financial incentive." James thought about the number Ashby had quoted for 5 minutes backstage, about the smile on Ashby's face when he'd quoted it, the smile of a man who had found a new source of revenue and intended to use it. "What's the right number?" James said.
Webb named a figure. James didn't blink. "Do it." Webb looked at him over his notes. "You understand that purchasing the contract doesn't automatically—" "I know. That's not the point." Webb studied him for a moment with the expression of a man who has handled estate matters for a duke for 10 years and is now navigating something considerably outside his usual territory, but is too professional to say so. "Very well," he said. "I'll make the approach." Ashby received Webb's initial approach with the wariness of a man who has built something carefully and is not sure yet whether an approach represents a threat or an opportunity. He requested a meeting. James attended it himself, which was not Webb's recommendation. Webb had suggested intermediaries, distance, the standard architecture of negotiation. But James had decided that this particular conversation required him to be present, and James had learned, in the weeks since the backstage room, to trust his own decisions slightly more than he previously had. They met in Ashby's Mayfair office. The well-furnished room, the good manners, the measured tones. Ashby opened by saying that La Voce Oscura was not something he was interested in selling, which was the opening position of a man who was absolutely interested in selling, but intended to make it expensive.
James said he understood, and that he respected Ashby's investment in the enterprise, and that he was prepared to be generous in recognition of that investment. Ashby said that generous was a relative term. James named a number. Ashby was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a man performing consideration he's already completed. "That's a significant offer," he said. "I'm aware," said James. "May I ask what your interest is in?" "No," said James pleasantly. "You may not." Ashby looked at him. He was very good at reading rooms, 30 years of practice, and what he read in James Ashworth's face was something that gave him a moment's pause. Not the eagerness of a man in the grip of an obsession, which was what he'd expected, and which would have been useful. Something steadier than that. Something that had thought this through and arrived. He named a counterfigure. James countered. They went back and forth 3 times. It took 11 minutes. The final number was higher than Webb's estimate and lower than Ashby's opening position, which was, Webb said afterward, about as good as these things ever went. Ashby extended his hand. James shook it. "A pleasure," Ashby said, with the smooth graciousness of a man who has just been paid very well for something he'd have had to give up eventually anyway. James said nothing. He had not come here to be pleasant to Edwin Ashby. He had come here to do one specific thing, and he had done it. And he left. In the carriage back, he sat with the signed document on his knee. He thought about what Webb had said.
Purchasing the contract doesn't automatically... He knew. The contract was not the point. The point was what he was going to do with it. He went to her directly, not through a note, not through the theater, not through any of the intermediary channels he'd been using for 14 months. He went to the address he'd found, not by any means he was proud of, a question asked of the right person with the right amount of tactful implication, and he knocked on the door on a Saturday afternoon in January. Cecily opened it. She looked at him, then at the street behind him, then back at him, with an expression that was working very hard at neutrality and not entirely succeeding. "You know where I live," she said. "Yes, I'm sorry. I needed to speak with you, and I didn't want to go through..." He paused. "I didn't want to go through Ashby." Something shifted in her expression, very slightly. "Why not?" James reached into his coat and produced a document, held it out. Cecily looked at it, didn't take it. "What is that?" she said, flat, not a question. "Your contract," he said. "Ashby's interest in it, which I've purchased." The world continued around them. A cart going past on the street, a child shouting something 2 houses down, the ordinary Saturday afternoon business of London. Cecily stood in her doorway and looked at the document, and her face did something complicated that she didn't entirely manage to prevent. "You bought my contract," she said. "Yes." "From Ashby?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because he was using it as a cage," James said, "and I wanted to give you the key."
Cecily looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that James, who had rehearsed this conversation with considerably more confidence than he currently felt, began to understand that he had no idea what she was going to say. "Come in," she said finally. He came in. The front room was familiar in the way of rooms you've heard described, the music everywhere, the organized chaos of a working life, the second violin on the hook by the window, a cat on a chair who opened one eye and closed it again with the magnificent indifference of cats everywhere. Cecily put the document on the table and stood across from it, arms folded, looking at it. "What are the terms?" she said. "There are no terms." She looked up. "I'm not Ashby," James said. "I'm not... This isn't a renegotiation. It's not a new arrangement. It's not..." He stopped, tried again. "I bought it because I wanted to give it to you. That's all. The document. Your work. Your..." He gestured slightly helplessly at the room, at the violin on the wall, at everything the room contained. All of it. It should have been yours from the beginning. Cecily was very still. "You're giving it to me," she said. "Yes. No conditions. No conditions. Nothing you want in return?" James looked at her. "I didn't say that," he said. She waited. "I would like," he said carefully, "the chance to know you. Not la voce oscura, not the masked soprano, not the thing I built in my imagination for 14 months. You, Miss Ashford, Cecily." A pause. "I walked past you in a ballroom in 1877, and I have thought about that more in the past month than I have about most things in my adult life. I would like..." He stopped. "I would like to not walk past you again." The room was quiet.
The cat shifted on the chair. Outside, London went about its Saturday. Cecily looked at him for a long time. The long, accurate look of a woman who has learned to see clearly and knows the difference between what something is and what it's presenting itself as. "You walked past me," she said, "once. In a ballroom." "I know." "And then you spent 14 months in my front row." "Yes." "And then you paid a significant sum to see my face." "Yes." "And now you've purchased my contract and come to my house on a Saturday afternoon." "Yes." A pause. "You are," Cecily said, A great deal of effort. Something happened to his expression, something she hadn't seen before, something that was not the Duke at a social occasion, or the man in a backstage room, or any of the versions of him she'd catalogued. Something younger, something almost uncertain. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. Then she unfolded her arms. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make tea." The tea was made and drunk, and a second cup followed the first, and they talked, carefully at first, the way people talk when they are being honest with each other, and the honesty is new, and neither party is sure yet how much weight it will bear. He asked about Madame Voss. She told him, the Tuesday afternoons, the lies about Clara Whitfield's piano, the first performance in Southwark, the shaking that stopped when she sang. She asked about the 14 months. He told her, the first evening, Gerald, the going back and the going back and the going back, the notes that came back unanswered. She asked if he'd known at any point that something was wrong with Ashby's arrangement. He said no, said it honestly, without deflection. Said he hadn't thought to look, which was a different thing from not knowing, and perhaps, in its way, worse. She accepted this, not easily. She was not a woman who accepted things easily, but accurately. He was being honest about his own blindness, which was more than most people managed. At some point, the afternoon had become evening. The lamp was on. The cat had relocated from the chair to the hearth. Cecily picked up the document from the table. She turned it over in her hands. 14 pages. Not the original 14. The original 14 were in Ashby's office somewhere. But this transfer document, shorter, cleaner, the legal language of a transaction completed. She looked at it for a moment. Then she stood and went to the hearth and held it to the flame. James watched from his chair. The paper caught. She held it until she needed to drop it, then let it go onto the grate, and they both watched it burn. The careful legal language, the clauses, the 10 years, all of it, until there was nothing left but ash and the soft collapse of something that no longer existed. Cecily stood at the hearth for a moment. Then she turned. "I should tell you that this doesn't mean I know," James said. "I'm not, I know. You walked past me. I know that too." She looked at him. "You're going to have to be very patient," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "I've been coming to your performances for 14 months. I have some experience with patience." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, almost a smile. The suggestion of one, arriving against her will, which made it the realest thing he'd seen from her. "Next Thursday," she said. "What's Thursday?" "There's a performance, if you'd like to attend." A pause. "The tickets are available at the box office, but if you'd prefer the front row, you should book in advance. It sells out." James looked at her. "I know," he said. "I've been booking in advance for 14 months." This time the smile arrived. Small, controlled, Cecily-shaped, but real. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said. The tea was made and drunk, and the second cup followed the first, and they talked, carefully at first, the way people talk when they are being honest with each other, and the honesty is new, and neither party is sure yet how much weight it will bear. He asked about Madame Voss. She told him. The Tuesday afternoons, the lies about Clara Whitfield's piano, the first performance in Southwark, the shaking that stopped when she sang. She asked about the 14 months. He told her. The first evening, Gerald, the going back and the going back and the going back, the notes that came back unanswered. She asked if he'd known at any point that something was wrong with Ashby's arrangement. He said no, said it honestly, without deflection, said he hadn't thought to look, which was a different thing from not knowing, and perhaps, in its way, worse. She accepted this. Not easily. She was not a woman who accepted things easily, but accurately. He was being honest about his own blindness, which was more than most people managed.
At some point, the afternoon had become evening. The lamp was on. The cat had relocated from the chair to the hearth. Cecily picked up the document from the table. She turned it over in her hands. 14 pages, not the original 14. The original 14 were in Ashby's office somewhere, but this transfer document, shorter, cleaner, the legal language of a transaction completed. She looked at it for a moment. Then she stood and went to the hearth and held it to the flame. James watched from his chair. The paper caught. She held it until she needed to drop it, then let it go onto the grate, and they both watched it burn. The careful legal language, the clauses, the 10 years, all of it, until there was nothing left but ash and the soft collapse of something that no longer existed. Cecily stood at the hearth for a moment. Then she turned. "I should tell you," she said, "that this doesn't mean—" "I know," James said. "I'm not—" "I know. You walked past me. I know that too."
She looked at him. "You're going to have to be very patient," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "I've been coming to your performances for 14 months. I have some experience with patience." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, almost a smile. The suggestion of one arriving against her will, which made it the realest thing he'd seen from her. "Next Thursday," she said. "What's Thursday?" "There's a performance, if you'd like to attend." A pause. "The tickets are available at the box office, but if you'd prefer the front row, you should book in advance. It sells out." James looked at her. "I know," he said. "I've been booking in advance for 14 months. This time the smile arrived. Small, controlled, Cecily-shaped, but real. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said. And that's the story of Cecily Ashford, the plain sister, the woman no one looked at twice, the voice that made an entire city lean forward without knowing why, and the Duke who paid a fortune just to see her face, and found out, rather too late and rather too perfectly, exactly whose face it was. If this story found you today, if you've ever stood against a wall in a pale green dress and felt the room look through you, this one was for you. Leave me a comment. Tell me which moment got you. Don't forget to tell us which city you're watching from. I'll see you next story.